The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ravencrest Palace as Queen Isabella hurried through the East Wing corridors. Her silk slippers made no sound against the polished stone, but her heart pounded with each step. 3 days had passed since the incident, and King Alexander's silence had become a living, breathing thing that filled every corner of their ancient home. Isabella paused outside the throne room doors, gathering courage she didn't know she possessed. Inside, she could hear the low murmur of voices. The royal council was meeting without her again. Her husband's advisors had been coming and going like shadows, their faces grave and their conversations hushed. None of them would meet her eyes anymore. The heavy oak doors creaked open as she pushed through them. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and the conversation died instantly. Alexander sat at the head of the enormous mahogany table, his steel-gray eyes fixed on documents spread before him. He didn't look up. He hadn't looked at her properly in 3 days. "Your Majesty." Chancellor Mortimer rose from his seat, his weathered face showing the strain of recent events. "We weren't expecting you to join us this morning." Isabella lifted her chin, drawing on decades of royal training. "I am still queen of this realm, Lord Mortimer. These discussions concern my family as much as they do the crown." The silence that followed was deafening. Several council members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Lord Beaumont studied his hands with sudden fascination. General Hawthorne cleared his throat, but said nothing. Only Alexander remained perfectly still, his attention seemingly absorbed by whatever papers lay before him. "Perhaps we should adjourn for the morning," suggested Lord Pemberton, his voice carefully neutral. "Allow their Majesties some privacy to discuss matters." "No need." Alexander spoke for the first time since Isabella had entered. His voice was flat, emotionless. "The Queen was just leaving." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. In 30 years of marriage, through political crises and personal trials, Alexander had never dismissed her so coldly in front of others. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Alexander, we need to talk about what happened with my sister's family." This silence isn't helping anyone. Now he did look up, and the ice in his eyes made her take an involuntary step backward. "Your sister's family made their position quite clear, Isabella. As have I. There's nothing more to discuss." The council members looked as though they wished they could disappear into their chairs. Isabella felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these men who would carry this scene back to their wives, who would whisper about it in drawing rooms across the kingdom. "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen," she said with all the dignity she could muster. "I have other matters to attend to." She turned and walked from the room, her back straight and her head high. But once the doors closed behind her, she slumped against the wall, pressing her hands to her trembling lips. How had everything gone so terribly wrong? 3 days ago, they had all been one happy family. Well, perhaps happy was too strong a word. Her younger sister Victoria had always been the dramatic one, prone to passionate outbursts and grand gestures. But Isabella had thought those days were behind them. Victoria was 45 now, married to the Earl of Westbridge, mother to 3 grown children. Surely she had learned some restraint. The memory of that awful dinner came flooding back with painful clarity. It had started so well. Victoria and her family had arrived for their monthly visit, a tradition that had begun when Alexander first took the throne. Victoria's husband Edmund was always perfectly polite, if a bit stiff. Their eldest son Marcus had recently returned from his military service and was full of entertaining stories from his time abroad. Even their daughter Sophia, usually quiet and bookish, had seemed more animated than usual. But then, the conversation had turned to politics, as it inevitably did in royal circles. Alexander had mentioned the new trade agreements he was negotiating with the northern kingdoms, and Edmund had offered what Isabella thought was a perfectly reasonable suggestion about including certain protective clauses for domestic manufacturers. Alexander had listened politely, nodded at appropriate moments, and then completely ignored the advice. Not rudely, exactly, but with the kind of dismissive indifference that only royalty could truly master. Isabella had seen the flash of hurt and anger in Edmund's eyes, had watched Victoria's jaw tighten with familiar warning signs. She should have intervened then. Should have smoothly changed the subject or found some graceful way to acknowledge Edmund's contribution. But she had been distracted by Sophia's sudden announcement that she was engaged to a young professor from the university, a man none of them had ever met. The explosion had been spectacular. Victoria had accused Alexander of treating her family like servants whose opinions didn't matter. Edmund had made some pointed comments about the crown's growing isolation from its own nobility. Marcus had defended his father, which had led to a shouting match between the cousins. And, through it all, Alexander had sat in stony silence, his face growing colder with each passing moment. The final straw had come when Victoria, red-faced and trembling with rage, had stood and declared that she was tired of watching her husband and children be treated like inconvenient relatives at their own family gatherings. She had said things that could never be taken back, questioned Alexander's fitness to rule, accused him of arrogance and blindness to the needs of his people. Isabella had watched her husband's expression transform from cold indifference to something far more dangerous. When he finally spoke, his voice had been quiet, controlled, and absolutely lethal. "Lady Westbridge," he had said, using Victoria's formal title rather than her name. "I think you've said quite enough. Perhaps it would be best if you and your family return to your estate until you can remember how to conduct yourselves appropriately in the presence of your king." The silence that followed had been deafening. Victoria had gone pale, finally, understanding that she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Edmund had stood and offered a stiff bow, his own face flushed with anger and embarrassment. The children had looked confused and frightened. They had left that night, their carriages disappearing into the darkness, while Isabella stood at her bedroom window, wondering how a simple family dinner had turned into such a disaster. Alexander had retired to his study and hadn't spoken to her since. Now, leaning against the corridor wall, Isabella tried to figure out how to fix what felt utterly broken. Victoria had always been impulsive, but she wasn't entirely wrong. Alexander had been growing more distant lately, more isolated from everyone except his inner circle of advisors. Even Isabella sometimes felt like she was speaking to a stranger wearing her husband's face. The sound of approaching footsteps made her straighten quickly. Lady Margaret, her closest friend and lady-in-waiting, appeared around the corner, her expression concerned. "Your Majesty? Is everything all right?" Isabella managed a weak smile. "Just catching my breath, Margaret. The morning has been rather trying." Margaret's sharp eyes missed nothing. She had been at court for over 20 years and had weathered many storms. "Perhaps we should take tea in your private parlor? Away from prying eyes and listening ears." Isabella nodded gratefully. Margaret always knew exactly what she needed. They walked in comfortable silence to Isabella's personal chambers, a suite of rooms decorated in soft blues and creams that had always been her sanctuary within the vast palace. Once they were safely behind closed doors, Isabella sank into her favorite armchair and, finally, allowed her composure to crack. "Oh, Margaret, I don't know what to do. Alexander won't speak to me. Victoria and her family have been banished in all but name, and the whole court is walking on eggshells." Margaret poured tea from the delicate porcelain service, her movements calm and measured. "The king is angry, Your Majesty. Understandably so. But anger fades. Family bonds run deeper than momentary quarrels." "Do they?" Isabella accepted the teacup with trembling hands. "You didn't see his face, Margaret. The way he looked at me when I tried to defend Victoria's right to speak. It was like he saw me as a traitor rather than his wife." Margaret settled into the chair opposite, her expression thoughtful. "King Alexander has always been a proud man. Perhaps too proud for his own good at times. But he loves you, Your Majesty. That much has never been in question." Isabella stared into her tea, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals. "Then, why won't he talk to me? Why does he shut me out when I try to discuss what happened?" "Because he knows you're right," Margaret said quietly. "And that's the hardest thing for a king to face, the possibility that his judgment was flawed, his reaction too harsh. It's easier to maintain the silence than to admit he might have been wrong." The truth of those words settled over Isabella like a heavy blanket. Alexander had always struggled with admitting mistakes, even small ones. It was perhaps his greatest flaw, and the source of many of their private disagreements over the years. But this felt different, bigger. This wasn't about choosing the wrong wine for dinner or misremembering a courtier's name. This was about family, about the people they were supposed to love and protect. "What do you think I should do?" Isabella asked, hating how lost she sounded. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering. "The king needs time to come to his own conclusions. But perhaps there are others who might help him see things more clearly. People whose opinions he values and whose loyalty is unquestioned." Isabella looked up hopefully. "You mean the council?" "Some of them, yes. Lord Pemberton has always been close to both you and the king. And General Hawthorne served with His Majesty during the border conflicts. They have the bond of shared hardship. If anyone could speak to him about the importance of family unity. It was a delicate suggestion, but Isabella could see the wisdom in it. Alexander might dismiss her concerns as emotional or biased, but he would listen to his trusted advisors, especially if they approached the subject carefully. And what about Victoria and her family? They're still at Westbridge Manor, probably planning to never darken our doors again. Margaret smiled slightly. Lady Victoria has never been one to hold grudges for long, Your Majesty. She's hurt and angry now, but she loves you too much to let this divide you permanently. The question is whether she'll be the first to extend an olive branch, or if that honor will fall to someone else. Isabella set down her teacup with sudden determination. Someone else, then? I won't let pride destroy my family, not when there's been enough damage already. Margaret nodded approvingly. What did you have in mind? I think, Isabella said slowly, the plan forming as she spoke, that it's time for me to pay a visit to Westbridge Manor. Unofficially, of course. Just a sister checking on her sister. No royal protocols, no formal announcements. Just family. It was a risky plan. Alexander would see it as defiance if he discovered her visit before she was ready to tell him. But sometimes, Isabella reflected, the greatest acts of love required the greatest risks. Outside her window, the palace grounds stretched endlessly toward the horizon, beautiful and serene. But Isabella knew that beneath the surface, currents of tension and hurt were reshaping everything she had worked so hard to build. The question now was whether she could find a way to heal the wounds before they became permanent scars. As Margaret began making discreet inquiries about preparing an unmarked carriage for the next morning, Isabella allowed herself a moment of hope. Family was worth fighting for, even when the battle had to be fought in silence and shadow. Especially then. The afternoon wore on, and still Alexander didn't come to find her. But, for the first time in 3 days, Isabella felt like she had a purpose beyond waiting for others to decide her fate. Tomorrow, she would begin the delicate work of rebuilding what had been broken. Tonight, she would plan and pray and hope that love would prove stronger than pride. The palace around her settled into its evening rhythms, but Isabella knew that sleep would be elusive. Too much depended on the choices made in the coming days, and she was no longer content to let others make them for her. The queen had been silent long enough. The dawn mist clung to the palace gardens as Isabella made her way to the servants' entrance, her dark cloak pulled tightly around her shoulders. She had barely slept, her mind churning with plans and possibilities. But determination had replaced the despair of the previous day. Margaret walked beside her, carrying a small traveling bag and wearing the expression of someone embarking on a dangerous mission. Are you certain about this, Your Majesty? Margaret whispered as they approached the unmarked carriage waiting in the shadows. If the king discovers your absence before you return. Isabella paused, her hand on the carriage door. The weight of 30 years of royal protocol pressed down on her shoulders, reminding her of all the rules she was about to break. Queens didn't simply disappear without permission. They didn't travel unannounced to visit banished relatives. They certainly didn't defy their husbands' implicit commands to stay away from family conflicts. I'm certain, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Alexander can be angry with me later. Right now, my sister needs to know that she hasn't lost everything. The carriage driver, a trusted man named Thomas who had served the royal family for over 15 years, helped her into the simple vehicle. It was nothing like the gilded state carriages she was accustomed to, just plain wood and worn leather seats, designed to blend in with common traffic. Margaret settled beside her, and, with a gentle lurch, they began their journey toward Westbridge Manor. The countryside rolled past the small windows in shades of green and gold, autumn beginning to paint the leaves in brilliant colors. Isabella found herself relaxing for the first time in days as they moved farther from the palace and its suffocating atmosphere of tension. Out here, she wasn't a queen caught between husband and sister. She was simply a woman trying to heal her family. Tell me about Lord Edmund, Isabella said as they settled into the rhythm of travel. Truthfully, Margaret, what do the servants say about him when they think no one important is listening? Margaret shifted uncomfortably. She had always been honest with Isabella, but speaking critically of nobility required delicate handling. He's respected, Your Majesty. The staff at Westbridge Manor speak well of him. He's fair in his dealings, pays promptly, doesn't demand impossible things. But, he's always felt overlooked, I think. Being married to the king's sister-in-law gives him a certain status, but no real power. He sees other earls consulted on important matters while his suggestions are politely ignored. It must be frustrating for a man of his intelligence and experience. Isabella nodded thoughtfully. She had always liked Edmund, but she was beginning to understand that she had never really seen him clearly. To her, he was simply Victoria's husband, pleasant enough, but not particularly noteworthy. But Edmund was also a landowner, a veteran, a man who managed vast estates and hundreds of tenants. His opinions carried weight in his own domain, even if they were dismissed at court. And Victoria? How has she been lately? Really, I mean, not just the face she shows at family gatherings. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching the landscape pass. Lonely, I think. Lady Victoria has always been the more social of you sisters, but since her children have grown and started their own lives, well, she's been searching for purpose. Her charitable work keeps her busy, but I suspect she feels adrift sometimes. The pieces began falling into place in Isabella's mind. Victoria, feeling purposeless and overlooked. Edmund, frustrated by his lack of influence. Both of them watching their children grow independent while they struggled to find their own relevance. No wonder the evening had exploded so dramatically. They had been carrying those feelings for months, perhaps years. The carriage hit a rut in the road, jarring Isabella from her thoughts. They were entering the village of Little Westbridge now, and she could see curious glances from the people they passed. Even in her simple cloak, there was something about her bearing that marked her as nobility. She pulled the hood more securely over her distinctive auburn hair. Westbridge Manor came into view as they rounded a bend in the road, a sprawling stone building that had housed the Earls of Westbridge for 3 centuries. It was beautiful in its own right, but modest compared to the royal palaces. Isabella realized she had never really thought about what it must be like for Victoria to visit Ravencrest Palace, to see the vast wealth and power that her sister commanded by accident of marriage while she remained in relative obscurity. Thomas brought the carriage to a stop in the circular drive, and Isabella felt her heart begin to race. What if Victoria refused to see her? What if Edmund forbade her entrance? What if the whole family had decided that the royal branch was too toxic to maintain contact with? But as the manor's front door opened, it was Victoria herself who appeared, having obviously spotted the unfamiliar carriage from a window. Her face cycled through confusion, recognition, and then something that might have been relief. "Bella," Victoria called, using the childhood nickname that no one else was allowed to speak. "What in heaven's name are you doing here?" Isabella climbed down from the carriage, suddenly unsure of herself. "I came to see you. To talk. Oh, Victoria, I've missed you so much these past 3 days." For a moment, the two sisters simply stared at each other across the drive. Then, Victoria's composure cracked, and she rushed forward to embrace Isabella with desperate intensity. "I thought you'd never speak to me again," Victoria whispered against her sister's shoulder. "I said such terrible things. I was so angry, but I never meant to hurt you." Isabella held her tightly, feeling tears she had been holding back for days finally spill over. "You didn't hurt me." "Well, not really. But you hurt Alexander, and he's taking it out on everyone." Victoria pulled back, her own eyes wet with tears. "Is he very angry?" "I know I overstepped, but Edmund was so upset, and the children were uncomfortable, and I couldn't bear watching him dismiss us like we didn't matter." "Come inside," Isabella said, glancing around at the servants and villagers who were beginning to gather at a respectful distance. "We need to talk privately." Victoria led her into the manor's main drawing room, a comfortable space decorated with warm fabrics and family portraits. Edmund appeared in the doorway moments later, his face carefully neutral. "Your Majesty," he said with a formal bow. "This is an unexpected honor." Isabella studied his expression, seeing the caution there, but also something that might have been hope. "Please, Edmund. Today I'm just Victoria's sister. Can we speak as family?" Edmund's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Of course. Would you like tea? Something stronger, perhaps?" "Tea would be lovely, thank you." As Edmund went to arrange refreshments, Victoria settled into a chair across from Isabella, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Bella, I need you to know that I never intended for things to escalate the way they did. But Alexander was being so dismissive. Not just of Edmund's suggestions, but of all of us. It was like we were furniture to be tolerated rather than family to be valued." Isabella sighed, recognizing the truth in her sister's words even as she felt the need to defend her husband. "Alexander has been under tremendous pressure lately. The trade negotiations, the border tensions with the Eastern kingdoms, questions about the succession. Sometimes I think the weight of it all makes him forget how to be human. But that's exactly the problem, Victoria said, leaning forward urgently. He's so focused on being king that he's forgotten how to be brother, husband, father. When was the last time he had a genuine conversation with Prince Thomas? When did he last ask about your feelings rather than just expecting your support? The questions hit uncomfortably close to home. Isabella's own relationship with Alexander had grown increasingly formal over the past year, their conversations revolving around state business and social obligations. She couldn't remember the last time they had simply talked about their hopes, fears, or dreams. Edmund returned with the tea service, and Isabella was grateful for the interruption. She needed time to process Victoria's observations without having to respond immediately. How are the children handling all this? Isabella asked as Edmund poured tea with careful precision. Victoria and Edmund exchanged a look. They're confused, Edmund admitted. Marcus keeps asking if he'll still be welcome at court functions. Sophia is worried that her engagement announcement got lost in all the drama. And little James. He paused, referring to their youngest, who at 22 was hardly little anymore. James thinks the whole royal family has lost its mind. Despite everything, Isabella found herself smiling at that. James always was the most sensible one. He gets that from his mother, Edmund said dryly, earning a sharp look from Victoria. Don't you start, Victoria warned, but there was affection in her voice. I may have been dramatic, but I wasn't wrong. Isabella sipped her tea, considering her words carefully. What if I told you that Alexander is just as miserable as the rest of us? That he's been locked in his study for 3 days, barely eating, snapping at his advisors, and refusing to discuss what happened? I'd say that's his pride talking, Victoria replied. Alexander has always had trouble admitting when he's wrong. But what if he doesn't know how to fix it? Isabella pressed. What if he wants to reach out, but doesn't know how without losing face? Edmund set down his teacup with a thoughtful expression. Kings aren't supposed to admit mistakes, are they? It undermines their authority, makes them appear weak to their enemies. Exactly, Isabella said, feeling like she was finally making progress. So he's trapped between his love for family and his duty to maintain royal dignity. And the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to find a graceful solution. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her expression cycling through anger, understanding, and something that might have been sympathy. So what do you suggest? That we pretend nothing happened? That Edmund and I crawl back and apologize for daring to have opinions? No, Isabella said firmly. I think we need to find a way for everyone to save face. A solution that lets Alexander show mercy without admitting error, and lets your family maintain dignity while rebuilding bridges. Edmund leaned forward with interest. What did you have in mind? Isabella took a deep breath, knowing she was about to propose something that could either heal their family or destroy it completely. What if there was a crisis that required us all to work together? Something that would make these personal grievances seem petty in comparison. The suggestion hung in the air between them, and Isabella could see both siblings considering the implications. It was a dangerous game she was proposing, manufacturing a situation that would force reconciliation. But sometimes, she reflected, desperate times required desperate measures. Outside the manor windows, the afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower, reminding Isabella that she needed to return to the palace before her absence was noticed. But, for the first time since that awful dinner, she felt hopeful that there might be a path forward. The question now was whether she could convince Alexander to walk it with her. The ride back to Ravencrest Palace felt much shorter than the journey out, though Isabella suspected that had more to do with her racing thoughts than actual time. Beside her, Margaret maintained a diplomatic silence, sensing that the Queen needed space to process everything that had transpired during their clandestine visit to Westbridge Manor. As the familiar towers of the palace came into view, Isabella felt the weight of her royal role settling back onto her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Out in the countryside, sitting in Victoria's comfortable drawing room, she had been able to think clearly, to see possibilities where before there had been only obstacles. But now, returning to the realm of protocol and politics, those solutions seemed far more fragile. Thomas, she called to the driver as they approached the servants' entrance. What time would you say we returned? Thomas, ever loyal and discreet, consulted his pocket watch with exaggerated care. Just past 3 o'clock, Your Majesty. Perfect timing for your afternoon correspondence, I'd say. Isabella smiled gratefully. Thomas understood the delicate game they were all playing. If anyone asked, she had spent the afternoon in her private chambers, dealing with personal letters and feminine concerns that wouldn't interest the king or his advisors. It wasn't technically a lie. She had been dealing with deeply personal matters, just not in the way they might expect. Margaret helped her change from her traveling clothes back into formal court attire, and within an hour of their return, Isabella looked every inch the composed queen. But, inside, her mind was working furiously, piecing together the plan that had begun forming during her conversation with Victoria and Edmund. The challenge was timing. She needed to approach Alexander when he was receptive, when his anger had cooled enough to allow reason, but before his pride had hardened into permanent resentment. She also needed to ensure that any solution appeared to come from him, not from her. Kings, as Edmund had astutely observed, couldn't appear to be following their wives' advice, especially in matters of state dignity. A soft knock at her chamber door interrupted her planning. "Enter," she called, expecting Margaret with the evening's social schedule. Instead, Prince Thomas stepped into the room, his young face creased with worry. At 25, Isabella's stepson was old enough to understand court politics, but still young enough to be wounded by family discord. Alexander's first marriage had ended tragically when Thomas was barely 10, and Isabella had done her best to be a mother to him. The boy's distress over the current situation was evident in every line of his posture. "Mother," he said, using the title he had bestowed on her years ago, despite having no obligation to do so. "I need to speak with you about father." Isabella gestured to the chair across from her writing desk, noting the way Thomas moved, all nervous energy and suppressed emotion. "What's troubling you, darling?" "This business with Aunt Victoria and Uncle Edmund," Thomas said without preamble. "Father won't discuss it with me, but I can see what it's doing to him. He's barely sleeping, barely eating. Yesterday, I found him standing at the window in the throne room, just staring out at nothing for over an hour." Isabella felt her heart clench. Alexander had always been a man of action, someone who solved problems through decisive leadership. This period of enforced inaction, trapped by his own pride and royal dignity, must be torture for him. "And it's affecting his judgment," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "The trade delegation from the northern kingdoms arrived this morning, and father was so distracted that he nearly insulted their chief negotiator. Lord Pemberton had to smooth things over." This was worse than Isabella had realized. If Alexander's personal turmoil was beginning to impact his official duties, the situation had moved beyond family drama into potential matters of state security. The northern kingdoms were crucial allies, and their trade agreements provided essential resources for the realm's economy. "What do you think should be done?" Isabella asked carefully. Thomas was intelligent and had been trained from birth to think strategically about royal responsibilities. His perspective might provide insights she had missed. Thomas was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words with care. "I think father needs to see that his choice isn't between family and duty. He's convinced himself that showing any mercy toward Aunt Victoria's family would make him appear weak. But what if the opposite were true? What if the strongest thing he could do would be to demonstrate that royal justice includes room for forgiveness?" Isabella stared at her stepson with new appreciation. The young man had inherited his father's strategic mind, but apparently possessed the emotional intelligence that Alexander sometimes lacked. "That's very wise, Thomas. But how do you suggest we help him see that?" "We don't," Thomas said with a slight smile that reminded Isabella of Alexander at his most charming. "We create circumstances where he comes to that conclusion himself." The echo of her own thoughts from earlier in the day made Isabella lean forward with interest. "What do you mean?" "The Harvest Festival," Thomas said, his excitement growing as he spoke. "It's next week, and, traditionally, the whole extended royal family participates. If Aunt Victoria and her family don't attend, everyone will notice. It'll become a public symbol of division within the royal house." Isabella nodded slowly, seeing where he was leading. "But if they do attend, then father has to decide whether to publicly humiliate his own sister-in-law by snubbing her, or find a way to appear magnanimous while saving face." Thomas grinned. Either choice becomes a statement about the kind of king he wants to be. It was brilliant in its simplicity, and Isabella felt a surge of maternal pride. But there were complications to consider. Victoria and Edmund would have to agree to attend, knowing they might face public embarrassment. And your father would need to be prepared for their presence without being warned in advance. "Leave Aunt Victoria to me," Thomas said confidently. "I'll write to Cousin Marcus." He's been wanting to show his father that military service has matured him. This would be perfect opportunity for him to act as a mediator. Isabella considered the plan from every angle she could think of. It was risky, certainly. If Alexander reacted poorly to his sister-in-law's unexpected appearance at the festival, the public nature of the snub would make reconciliation even more difficult. But if he responded with royal grace and dignity, it would provide a face-saving path back to family unity. And what about the practical arrangements? She asked. Victoria and her family would need somewhere to stay, formal invitations, coordination with the festival organizers. Thomas's smile widened. I thought you might handle those details, Mother. After all, as Queen, you have every right to ensure that all appropriate family members receive proper invitations to royal functions. The young man was giving her perfect cover for taking action without appearing to defy Alexander's unspoken ban on contact with Victoria's family. If questioned, she could simply claim she was fulfilling her ceremonial duties as queen, ensuring that all protocol was properly observed for such an important public event. You've thought this through quite thoroughly, Isabella said with admiration. But, tell me honestly, what do you think your father will do when he sees them? Thomas sobered, and for a moment Isabella could see the worried son beneath the calculating prince. I don't know, he admitted, but I know what he should do, and I think deep down, he knows it too. Father isn't cruel, Mother. He's just stuck. Sometimes people need help getting unstuck, even kings. Especially kings, Isabella thought, but she didn't say it aloud. Instead, she rose and moved to her writing desk, pulling out official stationery bearing the royal seal. Very well, she said, taking up her pen. I believe it's time I fulfilled my ceremonial obligations and ensured proper family representation at the Harvest Festival. As she began drafting the formal invitations, Isabella felt a familiar thrill of anticipation. She had forgotten how much she enjoyed the strategic aspects of court life when they were used for construction rather than destruction. And having Thomas as an ally made the enterprise feel less like betrayal and more like family solidarity. The afternoon slipped away as they worked together, planning logistics and anticipating contingencies. Margaret appeared periodically with refreshments and updates on palace activities, reporting that the king remained closeted with his advisors and had shown no interest in his wife's whereabouts. By evening, the invitations were written, sealed, and ready for discreet delivery. Thomas had composed a carefully worded letter to Marcus, framing the Harvest Festival attendance as a patriotic duty that would demonstrate the family's commitment to royal traditions despite recent personal difficulties. There's one more thing, Isabella said as Thomas prepared to leave. We need to ensure that your father is in the best possible frame of mind when the festival arrives. Can you think of ways to improve his mood over the next few days? Thomas considered this seriously. I could invite him to go hunting. He always enjoys that, and it might give us a chance to talk about leadership and mercy without directly addressing the current situation. Perfect. And perhaps I can arrange for his favorite musicians to perform during dinner tomorrow. Small pleasures might help soften his disposition. They were walking a careful line, both of them aware that too much obvious manipulation would backfire spectacularly. Alexander was many things, but he wasn't stupid. Any attempt to manage his mood had to appear natural and coincidental. As Thomas kissed her cheek and departed for his own chambers, Isabella felt simultaneously hopeful and terrified. In 1 week's time, the Harvest Festival would either mark the beginning of healing for their fractured family, or it would create a public spectacle that would damage the royal reputation for years to come. But sometimes, she reminded herself as she prepared for another tense dinner with her uncommunicative husband, the greatest victories required the greatest risks. And this was one battle she was determined not to lose. The week leading up to the Harvest Festival passed in a strange mixture of careful normalcy and underlying tension. Isabella maintained her regular schedule of court functions and charitable visits, but every activity was calculated to gradually improve Alexander's disposition without appearing manipulative. She arranged for his favorite foods to appear at dinner, ensured that his meetings ran smoothly by briefing his advisors in advance, and filled the palace with music and flowers that might lift his spirits. Alexander himself seemed to be emerging slowly from his self-imposed isolation. The hunting trip with Thomas had clearly done him good. He returned more relaxed than Isabella had seen him in weeks, with color in his cheeks and something approaching contentment in his manner. He still hadn't addressed the situation with Victoria's family directly, but He had begun acknowledging Isabella's presence with nods and brief comments, a vast improvement over the complete silence of the previous week. On Thursday afternoon, 3 days before the festival, Isabella was reviewing final preparations with the palace event coordinators when Margaret appeared at her elbow with a discreet cough. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "there's been a response to the family invitations. Lord and Lady Westbridge have formally accepted, as have all their children." Isabella felt her heart skip a beat. Part of her had feared that Victoria might decline, too hurt or proud to risk further humiliation. But her sister had chosen to trust in Isabella's plan, demonstrating the same courage that had gotten her into trouble in the first place. "Excellent," Isabella said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Please ensure that the guest chambers in the West Wing are prepared for their arrival. And Margaret? Not a word to anyone about this until they actually appear. I want their attendance to be a pleasant surprise." Margaret's knowing look suggested she understood exactly what kind of surprise was being arranged, but she simply nodded and slipped away to make the necessary arrangements. Friday brought a flurry of last-minute festival preparations as nobles began arriving from across the kingdom. The Harvest Festival was one of the most important events on the royal calendar, combining religious ceremony with political theater and public celebration. It was also, Isabella realized with growing nervousness, the perfect stage for either a dramatic reconciliation or an equally dramatic public humiliation. Alexander, meanwhile, had thrown himself into festival preparations with an energy that suggested he was grateful for the distraction. Isabella watched him reviewing parade routes with military precision and discussing ceremonial protocols with passionate attention to detail. This was Alexander at his best, the consummate royal performer who understood instinctively how to project strength, dignity, and benevolent authority. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden autumn light that made the palace grounds look like something from a fairy tale. Isabella dressed with unusual care, choosing a deep green gown that would photograph beautifully and jewelry that spoke of royal dignity without ostentation. Today, everything would be scrutinized and remembered. "You're nervous," Alexander observed as they shared breakfast in their private dining room. It was the first unsolicited comment he had made to her in over a week, and Isabella felt a flutter of hope. "A little," she admitted. "The Harvest Festival is always important, but this year feels significant somehow." Alexander studied her face with the shrewd intelligence that made him such an effective ruler. "You're worried about something specific." It wasn't quite a question, and Isabella chose her words carefully. "I suppose I'm hoping that today will mark a new beginning for us all. A chance to move forward from recent difficulties." "Recent difficulties," Alexander repeated with a slight, wry smile. "Is that what we're calling the complete breakdown of family relations?" The fact that he could joke about it, even darkly, suggested that his anger was finally cooling. Isabella seized the opening. Victoria was wrong to speak as she did, but she wasn't wrong about everything, Alexander. "We have been distant lately. From each other, from the family, from the people we serve." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. When he spoke, his voice was tired rather than angry. "Being king is a lonely business, Isabella. Sometimes I think the crown isolates me even from the people I love most." Isabella reached across the table to touch his hand, the first physical contact they had shared since the awful dinner. "It doesn't have to be that way. The crown should connect you to the people who matter, not separate you from them." "Perhaps," Alexander said, not pulling away from her touch. "We'll see what today brings." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of various advisors and coordinators, but Isabella felt more hopeful than she had in days. Alexander was thinking, questioning his own behavior, possibly even preparing to admit that change was needed. If Victoria's appearance at the festival caught him in this reflective mood, there might be a real chance for healing. The morning passed in a blur of final preparations and formal greetings as distinguished guests continued arriving. Isabella threw herself into her ceremonial role as queen, welcoming nobles and their families with gracious warmth while keeping one eye on the palace entrances. Victoria and her family were expected to arrive around midday, just before the formal procession to the festival grounds. At 11:30, Margaret appeared at Isabella's side during a lull in the receiving line. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "the Westbridge carriage has been spotted approaching the main gate." Isabella's stomach clenched with nervous anticipation. "Thank you. Please ensure they're shown to their chambers immediately, and let them know that the family gathering is scheduled for noon in the blue drawing room." She had timed it perfectly. The blue drawing room was where the extended royal family always gathered before public events to coordinate their appearances and receive final instructions. If Victoria and her family appeared there at the designated time, Alexander would encounter them in a context that emphasized family unity and shared duty rather than personal grievance. As the clock approached noon, Isabella made her way to the blue drawing room with carefully controlled steps. Alexander was already there, resplendent in his formal ceremonial uniform, discussing parade logistics with Thomas and several cousins. The conversation was relaxed, even jovial, exactly the atmosphere Isabella had hoped for. "I believe we're just waiting for a few more family members," Isabella said casually, taking her place beside Alexander. "Oh, who else is coming?" Alexander asked without much interest, his attention still focused on the ceremonial schedule. Before Isabella could answer, the drawing room doors opened and Victoria appeared, elegant in deep blue silk, and clearly nervous but determined. Behind her came Edmund in formal court dress, followed by Marcus in his military uniform, Sophia in a lovely pale yellow gown, and James looking uncomfortable but resolute. The conversation in the room died instantly. Alexander went completely still, his hand tightening on the parade route he was holding. For a moment that felt like an eternity, no one moved or spoke. Then, Thomas, bless him, stepped smoothly into the breach. "Aunt Victoria, Uncle Edmund," he said warmly, crossing the room to embrace his relatives. "How wonderful that you could join us for the festival. It wouldn't be the same without the whole family here." His words carried a subtle emphasis that reminded everyone present of the public nature of the day's events and the importance of family unity. Victoria responded gratefully to his embrace, and Isabella saw tears glittering in her sister's eyes. Alexander remained frozen for another heartbeat, and Isabella held her breath, aware that everything hung in the balance of his next words or actions. The room watched him with the fascinated attention usually reserved for natural disasters or theatrical performances. Finally, slowly, Alexander set down the papers he was holding and stepped forward. His face was carefully neutral, giving nothing away, but Isabella could see the rapid calculation going on behind his eyes. He was a politician first and a king second, and both roles demanded careful consideration of appearances and consequences. "Lady Westbridge," he said formally, offering Victoria a precise bow. "Lord Westbridge." The use of their formal titles rather than family names was telling, but not necessarily hostile. It was the greeting of a sovereign to respected nobles rather than relatives, which suggested Alexander was seeking middle ground rather than open confrontation. Victoria curtsied deeply, her own voice carefully controlled. "Your Majesty, Your Majesty." She addressed both Alexander and Isabella, acknowledging their royal status while subtly offering submission and respect. Edmund's bow was equally formal and correct, his soldiers bearing evident in every line of his posture. "We are honored to be included in such an important royal celebration." The carefully diplomatic language seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. Everyone understood that they were performing now, playing roles that emphasized respect and unity rather than personal feelings. It was a very royal solution to an impossible situation. Alexander studied the assembled family for another moment, then seemed to reach some internal decision. "Indeed," he said with a slight warming in his tone, "the Harvest Festival is a celebration of our kingdom's prosperity and our people's loyalty. It's appropriate that all members of the royal family should participate in such an important occasion." Isabella felt her knees go weak with relief. He was choosing reconciliation, or at least the appearance of it. The words were formal and careful, but they were also a public declaration that Victoria's family remained part of the royal circle. "Now then," Alexander continued, his manner becoming more businesslike as he moved into his role as ceremonial coordinator, "I believe we should review the procession order and ceremony protocols. Lord Westbridge, your military experience would be valuable in coordinating the Veterans Parade section." And just like that, Edmund was being consulted rather than dismissed, included rather than ignored. Isabella caught Victoria's eye across the room and saw her sister's grateful smile, understanding passing between them without words. The next hour passed in organized chaos as the family prepared for their public appearances. Gradually, the atmosphere in the room relaxed as everyone focused on practical matters rather than personal grievances. Alexander demonstrated his considerable skills as a leader and organizer, bringing out the best in everyone while maintaining appropriate dignity. As they prepared to leave for the festival grounds, Isabella found herself walking beside Victoria toward their ceremonial carriage. "Thank you," Victoria whispered, so quietly that only Isabella could hear. "I know this was your doing." "It was Thomas's idea as much as mine," Isabella whispered back. "And Alexander's choice to make it work. Will it work, do you think? Or is this just performance?" Isabella glanced ahead at Alexander, who was engaged in animated conversation with Edmund about veterans' affairs. "I think," she said slowly, "that sometimes performance becomes reality if you do it well enough and long enough." Outside the palace, thousands of citizens had gathered to celebrate the harvest and honor their royal family. Today, Isabella reflected as she prepared to step into the public eye, they would see a united royal house celebrating together. What happened behind palace doors in the days and weeks to come would depend on whether that unity could survive the transition from performance to reality. But, for now, it was enough that they were together, moving forward into whatever came next as a family rather than as enemies. The festival awaited, and, with it, the next chapter in their complicated story. The festival grounds stretched across the royal meadows in a magnificent display of autumn abundance and national pride. Golden banners snapped in the crisp breeze while hundreds of decorated stalls offered everything from prize-winning vegetables to handcrafted goods. The air filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and celebration as citizens from across the kingdom gathered to mark another successful harvest and honor their royal family. Isabella sat on the royal platform, watching Alexander move through the crowd with the easy confidence that made him such an effective public figure. He was in his element here, stopping to speak with farmers about their crops, admiring children's costumes, and generally projecting the kind of accessible authority that reminded people why they were proud to be his subjects. Beside her, Victoria and Edmund maintained their own dignified public personas, graciously acknowledging the respectful greetings they received while carefully following Alexander's lead in all interactions. The morning had passed without incident, each member of the royal family playing their part in the elaborate public performance. But Isabella knew that the real test would come during the afternoon ceremonies, when they would all be seated together on the platform for extended periods, their every interaction visible to thousands of observers and dozens of chroniclers who would report on the day's events to nobles across the kingdom. "The Veterans Parade is forming up," Thomas reported quietly as he returned from coordinating with the festival marshals. Father asked Uncle Edmund to review the formations with him. Isabella felt another flutter of hope. Alexander, continuing to include Edmund in ceremonial responsibilities, suggested that this morning's reconciliation might have deeper roots than mere public necessity. But she also knew that the true measure would come in private moments, when there was no audience to perform for. The Veterans Parade was spectacular, hundreds of former soldiers marching in perfect formation while the crowd cheered their service and sacrifice. Alexander and Edmund stood together at the platform's edge, both men clearly moved by the display of military precision and national pride. For a moment, watching them, Isabella could almost forget the tension of the past week. "They look good together," Victoria murmured, settling beside Isabella as the parade concluded. "Edmund has missed having someone who understands military service to discuss these things with." "Alexander has too, I think," Isabella replied thoughtfully. "He served with distinction, but being king means he can't really be one of the veterans anymore. Edmund bridges that gap." The afternoon brought the ceremony's formal components: speeches about agricultural success, presentations of awards to outstanding farmers and craftsmen, and the traditional royal blessing of the harvest. Alexander performed each element with practiced skill, but Isabella noticed that he seemed more relaxed than usual, as if the morning's successful navigation of family politics had lifted some invisible burden from his shoulders. When it came time for the family banquet, held in the great pavilion erected specifically for the festival, Isabella found herself seated between Alexander and Victoria, an arrangement that would have been impossible just days earlier. The placement sent a clear message to all observers. Whatever difficulties had existed within the royal family were now resolved. "Lord Westbridge," Alexander said as the first course was served, addressing Edmund directly for the first time in a purely social context. "I understand that your estate has experimented with some innovative crop rotation techniques this year. I'd be interested to hear about the results." Edmund's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm as he launched into a detailed explanation of his agricultural innovations. This was clearly a subject he was passionate about, and Alexander listened with every appearance of genuine interest, asking intelligent questions, and offering thoughtful observations. Isabella caught Victoria's eye across the table and saw her sister's pleased surprise. This wasn't mere politeness on Alexander's part. He was genuinely engaging with Edmund as an equal, recognizing expertise and showing respect for accomplishment. It was exactly the kind of interaction that Victoria had been hoping for during that disastrous dinner a week ago. As the meal progressed, conversation flowed more naturally. Marcus regaled the table with stories from his military service. Sophia discussed her engagement plans with evident happiness, and even young James emerged from his usual reserve to share observations about estate management that impressed everyone present. "You know," Alexander said during a lull in conversation, "I've been thinking about something Thomas mentioned during our hunting trip. The importance of ensuring that royal policy reflects the wisdom of those who actually implement it at ground level." The comment was carefully neutral, but Isabella recognized it as a significant concession. Alexander was acknowledging, however, indirectly, that he might benefit from listening more carefully to advisors like Edmund who had practical experience with the subjects they discussed. "That's very wise, Your Majesty," Edmund replied carefully. "Sometimes those of us in the provinces see effects of policy decisions that aren't immediately apparent from the capital. Indeed, perhaps we should arrange more regular consultations. I'm planning some reforms to agricultural taxation next year, and your perspective would be valuable." Isabella had to suppress a smile. Alexander was offering Edmund exactly what he had wanted: real consultation on matters of policy, genuine respect for his expertise, inclusion in meaningful royal business. And he was doing it in a way that appeared to be his own idea rather than a concession to family pressure. The evening entertainment featured traditional harvest songs and dances performed by groups from across the kingdom. As they watched the colorful displays, Isabella found herself thinking about the day's broader significance. On the surface, it had been a successful public event that reinforced royal authority and celebrated national prosperity. But underneath, it had been something more important: a family finding its way back to each other. "Bella," Victoria said quietly during one of the musical interludes, "I owe you an apology. And Alexander too." Isabella turned to study her sister's face in the torchlight. "For what?" "For forcing this crisis in the first place. I was so focused on what I thought we deserved that I forgot to appreciate what we had. Edmund being dismissed occasionally was better than Edmund being excluded entirely." "You weren't wrong to want more," Isabella said gently. "You were just wrong about how to get it." "The direct approach," Victoria said with a wry smile. "I always was too impatient for subtlety." "Sometimes direct approaches work too," Isabella pointed out. "If you hadn't forced the issue, we might have drifted along in polite dissatisfaction for years." As the evening wound down and guests began departing, the royal family gathered once more in the blue drawing room to review the day's events and coordinate departure schedules. The atmosphere was markedly different from that morning's tense reunion: relaxed, familial, genuine. "I believe today went very well," Alexander said, settling into his favorite armchair with visible satisfaction. The public response was enthusiastic, the ceremonies proceeded smoothly, and "I think we demonstrated the kind of family unity that strengthens the crown." He looked around the room as he spoke, his gaze including everyone present. When his eyes met Edmund's, he nodded slightly. "Lord Westbridge, I meant what I said about consulting on agricultural policy. Perhaps you could arrange to spend some time at court over the winter months? There's a great deal we should discuss." Edmund's pleasure was evident in his posture and expression. "I would be honored, Your Majesty, and grateful for the opportunity to serve." "Excellent. And I think," Alexander paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "I think all of us have learned something valuable about the importance of listening to different perspectives. Family perspectives especially." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was as close to one as a king could offer. Isabella saw Victoria's eyes fill with tears of gratitude and relief. "Thomas," Alexander continued, turning to his son, "that suggestion of yours about regular family councils, not formal state business, but informal discussions about kingdom affairs. I think we should implement that. What do you call it when civilians advise the military?" "A civilian oversight committee," Thomas replied with a grin. "Exactly. A family oversight committee. Make sure I don't become too isolated in my decision-making." The conversation continued for another hour, but Isabella found herself observing more than participating. She watched Alexander rebuild bridges with careful, deliberate effort. She watched Victoria and Edmund begin to relax into genuine comfort rather than nervous performance. She watched the next generation, Thomas, Marcus, Sophia, and James interact with the easy affection of cousins who had been temporarily separated but never truly divided. Most importantly, she watched her husband remember how to be a person as well as a king. The rigid control that had characterized his behavior over the past week was gradually giving way to something more natural, more genuinely Alexander. As the family prepared to retire for the evening, Alexander approached Victoria with something approaching his old warmth. "Sister," he said, using the familial title for the first time since the crisis began. "I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you all are here." Victoria's response was simple but heartfelt. "We're family, Alexander." "That has to mean something." "It does," Alexander replied firmly. "It means everything." Later, as Isabella prepared for bed in their private chambers, Alexander appeared in the doorway of her dressing room. They had barely spoken privately since the morning, and she felt suddenly nervous about what he might say now that they were alone. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For arranging today. For bringing them back. For—" He paused, clearly struggling with words that didn't come easily to kings. "For seeing what I was too proud to see myself." Isabella turned from her mirror to face him fully. "What was that? That being right isn't worth being alone. That royal dignity matters less than royal family." He moved closer, and she could see vulnerability in his expression that he rarely allowed others to witness. "I missed you this week, Isabella. I missed all of you." "We missed you too," she said softly. "But we're here now. All of us." Alexander nodded, reaching out to take her hand in the gesture of connection that had been missing for far too long. "Tomorrow I think I'll ask Edmund to help me review the border garrison reports. He has experience with military logistics that might prove useful." Isabella smiled, recognizing the offer for what it was, another bridge being built, another step toward the family unity they had almost lost. "I think he'd like that very much." Outside their windows, the last lights of the harvest festival were being extinguished across the palace grounds. But, inside, something new was beginning, a royal family that had learned to listen to each other, to value connection over control, to choose love over pride. It had been a good day's work, Isabella reflected as she settled into bed beside her husband for the first time in a week. Sometimes the most important victories were won not on battlefields or in throne rooms, but around dinner tables and in drawing rooms where people remembered how to be family first and royalty second. The harvest was over, but the real work of rebuilding was just beginning. And, for the first time since that terrible dinner, Isabella was confident they would succeed.